Can you talk about going to the beach and the mountains?
Yeah, my parents had a beach house at 300 Charleston Avenue on the Isle of Palms that my mother and grandmother had bought, I think in the 30s, for $10,000, which was the most expensive sale on Isle of Palms at that time. And it was just the old style beach house, very open, no air conditioning, no heating, no insulation, just built for the summertime. At that time, on the front beach, subsequently, many years later, there was a road put in front of it and another row of front beach houses. But we'd go there every summer and leave on about the 15th of July and go up to Highlands, North Carolina. Um, because my mother and my father went back and forth to between our home here and the rented house in Highlands. Always rented the same house at Highlands. Um, and I remember it was before I-26, and the trip took literally all day. We leave out 6 o'clock in the morning, stop at Holly Hill at Bessinger's restaurant, which was the father of the Bessinger clan, have breakfast, go on to somewhere around Greenwood, South Carolina, and have lunch at a boarding house, and then get to the house at Highlands about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, open up, and stay there for the rest of the summer. So it was a good childhood summer, I can tell you.
And what was life like day-to-day basis on Isle of Palms in the summer?
Very, very laid back, I would say. Isle of Palms wasn't even fully developed then. I mean, at the north end of Isle of Palms, where Wild Dunes is, um, was jungle. I mean, it was.
I remember going to get a Christmas tree with y'all
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it was
as
it
a
was
child.
it was dunes and jungle, and there were still wild goats there. Whether they swam over from Goat Island or vice versa, I don't know. But I remember seeing wild goats, and there were rumors of there were still panthers up there and all. I don't know whether that's true or not, but it was pretty wild on the north end of would that be the north end of Isle of Palms.
Did you have a barn
On the where Isle of,
on the island?
no, we did not, but as I recall, my sister Mita, younger sister, did keep a horse out there at the house across behind our house, across the street, owned by Robert Knoth and his family, Knoth. He was a well-known forester in the area, and I think he had some sort of facility where she was able to keep her horse and ride on the beach.
Mm-hmm. Can we talk about just the legal world in Charleston and what it was like, if you remember when you were young and then when you were starting your profession and how it's different now?
Totally different. I think when I I became a member of the South Carolina Bar in '71, but I didn't come back to Charleston and start practicing until '73. And there may have been 300 or 400 lawyers, uh, members of the Charleston Bar at that time. So you knew pretty much everybody, if not well, at least who they were. And a handshake generally sufficed. I mean, you knew who you were dealing with. You knew when a handshake would suffice and when a handshake wouldn't suffice, depending on who you were dealing with. Um, and I remember it as a fairly low key but pleasant practice. I think when I started my full time job with Young Clement Rivers, I'd clerked with them previously. Um, my starting salary was $7,500 a year, which seemed to be big money to me at that time. But it was pleasant. One memory I have is shortly after I started practicing law at Young Clement Rivers, somebody gave me some papers and sent me down the street to see old Mr. Brockington, give him some documents. They said, Mr. Brockington's been practicing law for 50 years. I remember walking down the street with those papers in my hand thinking, 50 years? How could somebody still be alive after having practiced law for 50 years? Well, I've practiced law for 50 years and I'm still around.
Do you remember what your hourly rate was when you started?
No, I don't, but it was very low, I guarantee you. Every now and then I come across some old bill and think to myself, had we survived? But, you know, prices were totally different back then.
And who were the judges that you worked with?
Well, you know, I wasn't a litigating lawyer, but I did for there was a strict system of appointments to represent people who couldn't pay for lawyers. And I did get appointed to some of those. And the main judge I remember was Judge Stoney. Theodore, I think his first name was Theodore. Everybody called him Bubba Stoney. And I have one memory of being in, that judgeship, well, I think it was a county judge, has been abolished for a long time. It doesn't exist in South Carolina, that layer of judges. But I remember he had a courtroom in the old court building, corner of Broad and Meeting, that being there in some case in the summertime with, I mean, typical what you think of an old courtroom in the South in the summer. The ceiling fans rotating and the windows open and hot. Everybody taking off their coats. Everybody was in coat and tie, but kept the ties on, took off the coats. But I didn't have much interaction with the light. I mean, basically, I was a business lawyer, so I didn't have much court interaction.
And you worked for Young Clement. What were the other firms?
In town?
Yes.
Buste, Moore, Mouzon, and McGee, or Buste, Smythe, and Smythe, which I'd applied when I was in law school. I'd applied to clerk for them one summer and also to Young Clement Rivers one summer. And I got hired by Young Clement Rivers first, and then Henry Smythe Sr., who was a great lawyer, called me up and said, well, we got a position for you. And I told him, I'm sorry, I've already taken one with Young Clement. I remember he said, that was a summer that they were merging Moore, Mouzon, and McGee with Buste, Smythe, and Smythe. He said, well, it's just as well for you because I was going to have you carry books from one library to the other all summer. So I missed that bullet. I don't particularly remember any other firms. I think those were the two main firms in town. No small firms by today's standard, no regional firms, no national firms in town.
Well, and we're going to talk about your involvement with Historic Charleston, but what are some of the other organizations that you've been involved with?
The Gibbs Museum of Art, was on the board and president of that for some time. Middleton Place Foundation, I was on the board of that for about 20 years. Gosh, I guess there are a couple of others that I was pretty involved with.
Land Trust.
Well, Land Trust, yeah, I was on the Low Country, at that time, Low Country Open Land Trust. I was on the board of that and president for a period of time. They were all interesting, all enjoyable.
And how did you get involved with Historic Charleston Foundation?
You know, I really don't recall. Perhaps I was on some committees for a while, then was asked at some point to come on the board. I had known Kitty Robinson, who of course was president for 17 years, really since college, since she and my wife were college classmates and good friends at Converse College. And I worked with Kitty when she was head of the development office at Porter Goud, and also had probably done some things when she moved over to Historic Charleston. I don't remember exactly how I became involved.
And what's some of the work that you did with Historic Charleston that you enjoyed the most?
You know, some of the things that stand out in my memory, I was president 2002, 2003, and I followed Harold Pratt Thomas and came right before Frank Brumley. Um, During the time I was there, and the preceding in Frank Brumley's time until it was finally able to be sold, McLeod was an issue. What to do with McLeod? It had been bought. It was Everybody was glad to have bought it. And this was bought before my time, but it became sort of a white elephant. And during my time, we started looking for a way to sell it in the right to the right either the right individual or the right nonprofit in the right way. Didn't get accomplished in my time. As I say, it got sold in Frank Brumley's time, but that was a big issue. Um, one of my main pushes was to try to revitalize the revolving fund, which Historic Charleston Foundation had sort of put itself out of business as far as the reason it was concerned, to preserve historic buildings in Charleston. We'd done all that, and there weren't many more that we were able to acquire and preserve. I mean, it was easy when you could buy a building in Ansonboro or somewhere else for $15,000, $25,000. But when they started getting into the hundreds of thousands of dollars range, it got a lot more difficult. Plus, there were fewer of them. But I wanted to try to revitalize a revolving fund for other purposes, which has done a pretty good job at buying houses on Upper St. Philip Street and renovating them for people in the neighborhood to continue to live in, and that sort of thing. Another sort of landmark thing that happened was, unfortunately, the death of Miss Sally Rhea, who lived in Indianapolis, Indiana, who left about $1.4 million, I think, which was big money at that time for the foundation. She had been a friend of Charleston, and there were some family connections there too, and had left a fair amount of money to Historic Charleston, Drayton Hall, and some other organizations in Charleston. I mean, those are two of the things that stand out. Another issue back then that was sort of gone off the scene was the fact that back then Charleston started to be what some people called an urban resort destination. In other words, what's proliferated since then is people whose primary residence, if they have one, is somewhere else, who buy a house in Charleston and don't spend much time there. And you started getting neighborhoods that you'd walk down the street and, particularly in warm weather, and in a block of 8 houses, there might be 2 of them with lights on at night. So I remember we had one forum called Charleston at the Crossroads, which was Mayor Riley, a professor from New Orleans who taught at Johns Hopkins, named Fred Starr, who was dealing with the same issues where he had a house in New Orleans, and a couple of other people talking about what could be done about it, basically. And we spent some time looking into whether there could be restrictions on people owning houses and not living here, and finally decided that this is a country where you can do pretty much whatever you want to, so that really didn't get anywhere. There was one, Lawrence and Phyllis Walker. Lawrence had been a past executive director of the foundation for a while, actually put an easement on their house that said you couldn't buy it unless it was going to be your principal resident. And that's still on it. I assume that's worked out pretty well. And Mayor Riley wanted to, but he and his lawyer and my lawyer, we were very good friends, never could work out the details. There were the further you got into it, the more complicated that. So that never happened, but that was his intent. So those are 2 or 3 of the things that really stand out to me. And it was a fairly good time economically, financially, for Historic Charleston. The Baker Furniture royalties were very strong at that time. They fell off a cliff over a period of, say, 3 to 5 years, where people stopped buying brown furniture and started buying other kinds of things. But Baker and I guess the House and Gardens tour were the two big money makers for us.
Mm-hmm. When you've done so much work with the easement program, can you talk about easements?
Yeah, I mean, I've done as a lawyer, as a tax lawyer, I've done a lot of work with facade easements, facade and interior easements in houses, mostly in downtown Charleston, and also with conservation easements on tracts of land, plantations, and other tracts of land outside of Charleston. And people have been very receptive to that in Charleston. You know, theoretically, when you put an easement on your house, it requires you to do certain things and restricts you from doing others. It diminishes the value of the property because maybe the next buyer doesn't want to do all those things, so he buys something else. I don't think in practice that's ever happened in Charleston. I've never seen the real estate market go down in Charleston. It might have platformed a few times, but it never went down. Um, so I think Historic Charleston and the Preservation Society have been very successful in easements. I mean, when I was president, Historic Charleston had over 300 some facade and interior easements, or the older form, which were covenants, restrictive covenants. But I think that slowed down a good deal because all of the low-hanging fruit has been plucked, and there isn't much more out there to be able to put easements on. But I think people are still pretty receptive when it's explained to them properly.
And how have you seen that change over time?
Well, as I say, I think there are fewer opportunities to acquire easements now, but Historic Charleston hasn't, and I don't think should stop trying. I mean, they're still out there. And there have been some pretty awful things done to some pretty wonderful houses downtown, some of which weren't prevented, and I think some of which could have been done were prevented by easements.
Can you talk about the West Ashley corridor and your work protecting it?
You know, the thing about conservation is you're always on the defensive. I remember when I first got back to Charleston, or shortly after I got back to Charleston in the early mid 70s, was when I first started being aware of protection of that area and what needed to be done. And I remember very distinctly, I remember being in a meeting with your father and Charles Duell and Francis Edmonds. And your father and Charles Duell were really trying to pass the ball over to me because they were tired of carrying the ball by themselves. And we were basically, I think we were, as I recall, we were talking about the difficulties of doing it. And Francis Edmonds stood up and said something to the effect of, y'all are all a bunch of sissies, and we got to get tough and move forward on this thing, which kind of, yes, ma'am. We had to do it. But that was kind of my first introduction to trying to, and I think the impetus then was highway department talk about widening the road. I mean, I've heard talk about widening Highway 61 since I was 20 years old. And it still hadn't been done for good reasons. But that was my sort of my first introduction to that issue, and which has become a bigger and bigger issue over the years. And some things have been able to be done. I mean, my extended family has put conservation easement on most of our land. In my smaller family has got some land on the other side on the north side of Middleton also. And Middleton has got a kind of a limited conservation easement on it. But again, it's a very tough defensive position to be in. Right now, the 2,200 acres just south of Beast Ferry Road that the owner is trying to bring into North Charleston, there's a suit between City of North Charleston and City of Charleston as to who annexed it. Watson Hill, which is on the north side of Middleton, which is about 6,600 acres. There's a development going in now that's going to have, I think, up to 1,000 homes. Middleton can have up to 800 homes. When I say Middleton, I'm talking about land that's basically owned by Charles Dewell's children. So there's a constant battle to try to limit what can be done and have it done in a proper way. But it's been a constant involvement with that area.
And how about protecting along the river and across the river?
Well, there was an Ashley River development, an Ashley River plan that's been done, and I think the protection along the river, it's been sporadic, and it's been up to individual landowners. There's been some zoning protection. North Charleston, I think, has across from Drayton Hall, Magnolia, Millbrook, Middleton, on North Charleston side of the river. I think they have some modest buffer requirements, something like 50 feet. But it's been piecemeal, and it's been, again, mostly voluntary by landowners, particularly on the west side. What I think of is our side of the river.
And what about the communities sort of along 61? How have you seen changes there?
Well, from Pierpont north towards Somerville along 61, there have been some subdivisions. First Shadowmoss, then Village Green. So there's been, south of Bees Ferry Road along 61, there's been some fairly limited residential development, almost no commercial development. And then you've got a fairly long stretch where you have the plantations. And that long stretch includes those 2,200 acres that's trying to get into North Charleston. And then when you get north of Middleton, serious development is starting again with the Watson Hill project. You go right beyond that, you get to the 70,000 acres of East Edisto owned by Westvaco that's going to have, in the next 50 years, 50,000 homes or something. So other than that somewhat protected gap, which is more or less between Middleton and Magnolia, there's a lot of development, which is going to increase the traffic, which is going to increase the pressure to widen Highway 61. And there are better ways to do it, I think, than widening 61. I think, nobody wants to listen to me on this, but I still think it's a good idea, is instead of widening 61 to 4 lanes, is put another 2 lanes, maybe 50 yards west of 61. So you've got a parkway with current 61, 2 lanes going north, and new 61, 2 lanes going south. It would be a lot less disruptive for the property. It would be a lot less expensive. It could be turned into a fairly nice drive. But I remember my father 60 years ago with a plat on his hand saying, "Here's where the highway department wants to run through the middle of Millbrook and Middleton," and nothing's happened so far. But it'll happen one day.
Talk about the history of Millbrook and the changes there and around Millbrook?
Yeah, Millbrook, I think I made a reference to it some time ago. My grandfather owned about 5,700 acres. He was, his family, old low country family, like a lot of them pretty much lost all the plantations during the war. He was born in, and my grandfather I remember well. He died in his 90s in the like 64, I think. He grew up in Charleston, went to the University of South Carolina, was educated as a chemist, came back to Charleston and started a chemical lab. Above, as I understand it, is above where the Tavern liquor store is on the corner of Exchange and East Bay. and got into the fertilizer business. One of the things that helped the South recover from the Civil War, and I didn't finish the sentence, my grandfather was born in 1869 or 1870, so he was right after the Civil War. One of the things that helped the South revive in this area was that there are heavy deposits of phosphate in the area, which I understand came from when this area was covered by the ocean. And phosphate mining companies were active from late 1870s, 1880s, up until the early 1900s. And they'd go into these areas, dig ditches, and phosphate was usually, as I understand it, 10 to 14 feet underground, have laborers, a lot of them were imported Italian laborers, strangely enough, dig these large, wide ditches, find the phosphate, load them onto little trolleys that were on tracks that went back into the woods, carry them out to the Ashley River, load them onto barges, and take them to the Charleston Peninsula, what they call the neck, to be made into fertilizer, one of the principal ingredients of fertilizer. Phosphate was found more easily obtainable in northern Florida in the early 1900s, so the phosphate companies, many of which were out of the Northeast, sold their land, moved down to Florida. And my grandfather and another gentleman named Hertz, Hertz, bought from one of these mining companies several thousand acres on what's now Ashley River Road, Highway 61, for pennies on the dollar. I'm not sure whether the intention was to continue mining phosphate, which I don't think they ever did, or exactly why they bought it. But as a chemist, as somebody in the fertilizer business, my grandfather was interested in the property and bought out his partner a couple of years later. So the family since 1910 has owned Millbrook Plantation, which is right basically between Middleton and Magnolia Gardens on the river. And on the west side, most of it's on the west side of Highway 61. And I remember, since I grew up out there on the river, I remember spending a lot of time across the road where most of the land is, which is basically all pine trees now. At my deer hunting, at my grandparents' house that they used occasionally, that we always called the Porter House, because the original house had been burned or somehow destroyed after the Civil War. And my grandparents rebuilt it in the 20s or 30s, supposedly in the same style, a pretty modest brick house. But spending a lot of time out there, my grandfather would have a big hunt for his salesmen and clients at the end of deer season, every January the 1st. And there'd be a big spread. Everybody would come in, all the hunters would come in for lunch after the first couple of drives in the morning, and it was a big spread under the Oak Avenue. It was a big deal. I remember spending the night out there in the Porter House, which had no central heat, between blankets. This was on New Year's Eve, and having somebody come in the morning, light the fire, and get breakfast, go out and hunt. So I spent a lot of time out there. And at some point, my grandparents divided up the property among their three children. And as I said, gave each one of them about 50 acres on the river, and then divided the large acreage on the other side of the river. And it's come down that my sisters and I own the northernmost strip, which is between Ranto's Creek and Highway 61, which is right next to Middleton, on the west side of the river. And we all own, and I live out there. My wife and I built a house out there about 40 years ago on the river, near my parents' house. So that's sort of how Millbrook evolved. But it never really was, from the time my grandfather bought it, never really was a phosphate mining operation again. And I remember as a child talking to some old African American folks who grew up on the place, and about their memories of as children walking down the sand road with no shoes in the summertime and the sand, warm sand between their feet, and going up to a place called Stelling's Store, which is a store run by an old German guy, as I understand it. It was gone by the time I came along, to buy penny candy and that sort of thing. So there were people living on that property and on Middleton right next door who'd grown up there. Little settlements all around, mostly I think remnants of the phosphate days. So there's a lot of history to that area.
And some remnants of those structures still, old houses, ruins.
There's only one that I can think of that there's still something left on Millbrook. There was another place that I remember as a child that was in ruins then. In fact, there wasn't much more left than the first floor. That was, I was told, was the old Pinckney summer house. The Pinckneys, a little bit south of Millbrook, owned Runnymede Plantation. And the Pinckneys apparently had a summer house on what's part of Millbrook now, on the west side of the highway, because it was higher. It was, some planters went up to Somerville in the summertime because it was high. But this was a more local place to escape, to get away, in a drier place, higher and drier, sandy soil, to get away from the mosquitoes, for the Pinckneys, who were just down the road. But there's very little left from those old days. I mean, you can look at an old map and see where houses and barns and that sort of thing were. Very little of which is left now. I remember your grandfather had a barn near what was called the Williams settlement. There was an old house that's not there anymore, owned by somebody named William, and he kept cows in there. And I remember as a child riding around the property, horseback riding around the property, and every now and then running into some cow that had gotten loose.
A lot of people have spent time on Millbrook because of the hunt club and fox hunting. Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, the deer hunting club, the Middleton Hunt Club, which doesn't hunt on Middleton anymore, because that area of Middleton west of the highway is slowly being developed. No houses out there yet, but that sort of thing is coming. And just hunts on Millbrook now has been in existence since 1908. Started on Middleton, and maybe 40 years ago, they started renting for deer hunting season some of Millbrook. And as I say, are now entirely on Millbrook. So it's probably the last horse and hound deer hunting club in South Carolina, if not the South. And it's still going pretty strong. It's very nice. It's always been sort of a gentleman's club. Nice people who take good care of the land, so we're delighted to have them there. The Middleton Hounds Fox Hunting Club that started again in Middleton, and I don't know how long ago, 30 years maybe. I don't think hunts on Middleton any longer. They may occasionally, and for a while they hunted on Millbrook also, but it's contracted a good deal, and they're not nearly as active as they were 10 or 15 years ago. But those are the two main organized sports.
Did you hunt with those two groups?
I never hunted. I was always a pretty crummy rider. Just say it up front. I was a journeyman rider. Both my wife and daughter Grayson hunted with the Middleton Hounds. Both earned their colors. Grayson, which is when you're recognized as a competent rider. Grayson got her colors at 12, which was pretty good, and she was a heck of a rider when she was young. Still is. I'd ride with them every now and then, but I never did anything daredevil, because most of the time I was too bad a rider and knew it.
And
to rest. I hunted with the Middleton Deer Hunting Club a fair amount when I was younger. Um, but when my sons went off to college, I was no longer a member of the club after that.
And is the Sportsman group still?
The Sportsman, that's another story. Um, Probably 60 years ago, my father started. We've got a piece of property called Uxbridge on the north side of Middleton, about 700 acres. And my father started letting a group of black gentlemen from Somerville hunt on Uxbridge. And that's been going on for, as I say, probably 60 years now. Still hunts on Uxbridge. Very nice group of gentlemen. And occasionally they are invited to hunt on Millbrook. And I don't know whether the Middleton Deer Hunting Club, which hunts on Millbrook, still does this, but for a period of time, they once a year they'd invite each other to hunt with them, which was a grand event. I hope they still do it. I'm not sure whether they do. But that's the Sportsman Club, and there's probably only about a dozen, 12 to 15 members. It's small, but they're all really nice people.
And were there other kinds of hunting that you did at Millbrook growing up?
Well, when I was a child, there were no turkeys in the area. I mean, none. Nobody knew anything about wild turkeys. Didn't have any. And then quite a while ago, the wildlife department started reintroducing them to this area, and now turkey hunting is a big deal. There are a lot of turkeys out there, and we, for the last few years, my sisters and I, section of Millbrook, have been leasing it to basically a couple of friends, Grange Cuthbert and Tom Anderson, who go out there several times during the season, which generally runs from around the middle of March to end of April. I'm not a good hunter of any sort, although I've mostly enjoyed shooting ducks occasionally when I was younger. But I go out a few times with Grange's son, Simmons Cuthbert, who is an excellent turkey caller. And the last time I went out with a gun was a couple of years ago. And I got two turkeys at the same time, and I figured, well, this is probably a good time for me to stop shooting turkeys, stop at the end of my game. But I still like to go out with Simmons and just listen to him call the turkeys, listen to the turkeys call back, see the turkeys. It's quite a treat.
Have there been other changes besides turkeys as far as birds or coyotes, I'm sure?
Well, feral hogs have always been a problem. I mean, they're a bad problem. And coyotes. Never used to have any coyotes. Coyotes are a serious problem now because they eat young turkeys, they eat fawns. If a fawn survives until it's 1 year old, it's going to make it probably. But coyotes are very destructive of newborn fawns and young turkeys. Although the turkeys seem to do pretty well. Just getting back totally off the subject of Millbrook and hunting, but getting back to one thing you touched on earlier is the conservation in that area. Conservation, when I was growing up, was not a thing. I mean, people who own land generally took very good care of their land, and there wasn't much development because there wasn't any interest in development. But it started becoming a real problem when Charleston got to be noticed and a pleasant place to live or to have either a retirement or a vacation home. And in reaction to that, conservation community in this area, in the whole low country area, has become very strong. I mean, you've got people who have, like Charles and Hugh Lane, who've done such good work down in the Ace Basin. And you've got people like Dana Beach, who really has helped change the conservation ethos and scene in the Low Country. I remember when Dana, who was several years behind me in college, quite a few years behind me in college, originally from Columbia, went up to New York, worked in the financial area, met Virginia. They came down here. And Dana obviously saw the need to try to preserve what he came to love, in starting the Coastal Conservation League. And I remember when he first started, I thought, this guy alienates more people than he gets on his side, because Dana was a little brusque at first, very dedicated, but kind of harsh. Dana learned very quickly how to deal with people and who the right people to deal with were and how to get things done. And I think he's made a huge difference in the conservation community in this area and the conservation efforts. And you got other organizations like the Land Trusts. Low Country Land Trust, I think, has been very strong for a long time. And other organizations like the Southern Environmental Law Center that really have done a huge amount in protecting some of the most important aspects of this area. Hadn't always been victories, but there have been a lot of them. And it does get kind of tiring after a while, because it is, as I said earlier, a constant defensive battle. But it's a very necessary battle, and I can't give enough praise to the people like the Lanes and Dana Beach, who have really led the fight.
I think we're getting to a good place to stop, and I'm just going to end by saying that you were head of the nominating committee and asked me to be on the board, and I said no, that I was too busy and I had a new baby and I had lots of other commitments, and you said you can't say no.
Well, you couldn't. I mean, your mother was president. Your family's been around here for, our family, for such a long time. Because you were having children, that's the reason that you need to get in there and fight.
Yes, well, I'm very glad you didn't let me say no. So.
Well, you've always been a favorite of mine, Annie.